Harold wiped his tired eyes as he locked the school doors behind him. It was past midnight, and the old building creaked in the wind like it always did after a long day. He had been cleaning these same hallways for 15 years, mopping up after kids who barely noticed he existed. Tonight felt different, though. The air was thick and heavy, and dark clouds had been gathering all evening. His beat-up truck started on the third try, just like it had for the past 5 years. Harold didn't mind. The old Ford had character, and it got him home to his cabin, up in the mountains every night. As he pulled out of the school parking lot, the first drops of rain hit his windshield. By the time he reached the main road, those drops had turned into a steady downpour. The radio crackled with weather warnings. Severe thunderstorm watch in effect for all mountain areas. Flash flood warnings have been issued. Residents are advised to stay indoors and avoid unnecessary travel. Harold turned up the volume and kept driving. He had driven these mountain roads in all kinds of weather. A little rain never hurt anybody. But as he climbed higher into the hills, the storm seemed to follow him, growing stronger with each mile. Lightning split the sky like broken glass, lighting up the tall pine trees that lined the narrow road. Thunder followed so close behind that Harold could feel it in his chest. The rain was coming down so hard now that his wipers couldn't keep up. He had to lean forward and squint just to see the yellow lines on the road. The truck's headlights barely cut through the wall of water falling from the sky. Harold gripped the steering wheel tighter and slowed down to a crawl. He had been driving this route for years, but tonight everything looked different. The familiar landmarks were hidden, behind sheets of rain and darkness. A sudden gust of wind rocked the truck sideways. Harold felt his heart skip a beat as he fought to keep control. Tree branches crashed down somewhere in the distance, and he could hear the rush of water getting louder. The creek that usually ran alongside the road was turning into something much more dangerous. As Harold rounded a sharp curve, his headlights swept across something that made him slam on his brakes. There, stumbling along the side of the road, was a small figure. It looked like a child soaked to the bone and barely able to stay upright against the wind. Harold blinked hard, thinking his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. But when the lightning flashed again, there was no mistake. A little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, was wandering alone in the storm. The child's clothes were plastered to his small body, and he was walking with the unsteady steps of someone who was beyond exhausted. Without thinking, Harold pulled over and jumped out of his truck. The rain hit him like a cold slap in the face, soaking through his work shirt in seconds. He ran toward the boy, his boots splashing through puddles that seemed to appear out of nowhere. "Hey there, little guy," Harold called out over the roar of the storm. "What are you doing out here?" The boy looked up with wide, frightened eyes. His lips were blue, and he was shivering so hard he could barely stand. When he tried to speak, only a small whimper came out. Harold could see that the child was in serious trouble. "It's okay, son, I'm going to help you," Harold said, keeping his voice calm even though his heart was racing. He gently scooped the boy up in his arms. The child was so cold that Harold could feel it through his wet clothes. This wasn't just being caught in the rain. This was hypothermia setting in. Harold carried the boy back to his truck as quickly as he could. The wind was getting stronger, bending the trees at dangerous angles. Power lines were down somewhere because the few houses he could see in the distance were completely dark. He set the boy gently in the passenger seat and cranked up the heat as high as it would go. The child's teeth were chattering so loudly Harold could hear them over the storm. He grabbed an old blanket from behind the seat and wrapped it around the boy's small shoulders. "Can you tell me your name?" Harold asked softly. The boy looked at him with confused, scared eyes. "Tommy," he managed to whisper through his chattering teeth. "Okay, Tommy. My name is Harold. You're safe now. Can you tell me where your family is?" Tommy's eyes filled with tears. "We were camping. The water came so fast I ran, but I got lost. I've been walking for so long." Harold's heart sank. A flash flood at a campground could be deadly. The boy had probably been wandering in the storm for hours, maybe longer. His small body was shutting down from the cold and exhaustion. Harold reached for his cell phone to call for help, but the screen showed no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell towers. He tried the radio, but all he got was static. The landlines were probably down too. In weather like this, the mountain communities were completely cut off from the outside world. He looked at Tommy, who was still shivering despite the warm air blowing from the truck's heater. The boy needed to get somewhere warm and dry immediately. Harold's cabin was only about 10 minutes away if he could make it up the winding mountain road safely. "Tommy, I'm going to take you to my house where it's warm and dry. We'll get you some hot soup and try to find your family, okay?" The boy nodded weakly. Harold could see that Tommy was struggling to stay awake. That was a bad sign. The cold was affecting his brain now. Harold put the truck in gear and started the careful journey up the mountain. The road was getting worse by the minute. Small streams had turned into rushing torrents, washing rocks and debris across the pavement. Twice he had to stop and move fallen branches out of the way. The truck's engine strained as they climbed higher into the storm. Harold kept glancing over at Tommy, who was curled up under the blanket with his eyes closed. The boy's breathing was shallow but steady. "Almost there, buddy," Harold said, more to reassure himself than Tommy. When they finally reached his cabin, Harold had never been so happy to see the little wooden house. He had built it himself 20 years ago, back when he still believed his life would turn out differently. It was simple but solid, with a good roof and a stone fireplace that could heat the whole place. Harold scooped Tommy up again and ran for the front door. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, but it was dry and safe from the storm that was tearing apart the mountain outside. Harold quickly laid Tommy on the couch and started building a fire in the fireplace. As the first flames began to flicker and grow, Harold looked down at the small boy he had found in the storm. Tommy's eyes were closed, but his breathing seemed a little stronger now. Color was slowly returning to his pale cheeks. Harold had lived alone in this cabin for so many years that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to have another person there. Now, watching over this lost child, something stirred inside him that he thought had died long ago. Whatever happened next, he was going to make sure Tommy made it through this night safely. Harold spent the first hour just watching Tommy sleep by the fireplace. The boy's breathing had gotten steadier and some color had returned to his face. Every few minutes, Harold would check to make sure Tommy was still warm enough, adjusting the blankets and adding another log to the fire. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. Harold could hear trees crashing down in the forest around his cabin. The wind howled through the mountains like a wild animal, rattling his windows and making the whole house shake. When Tommy finally woke up, the sun was trying to peek through the gray clouds, but the rain was still pounding on the roof. The boy sat up slowly and looked around the unfamiliar room with wide, confused eyes. "Where am I?" Tommy asked in a small voice. "You're in my cabin," Harold said gently. "Remember? I found you on the road last night during the storm. My name is Harold." Tommy nodded slowly as the memory came back to him. Then his eyes filled with tears. "I want my mom and dad." Harold's chest tightened. He had never been good with crying children. When his own son was little, his wife had always been the one to handle the tears and scraped knees. But there was something about this scared little boy that made Harold want to try. "I know you do," Harold said, sitting down on the edge of the couch. "We're going to find them, I promise. But right now the phones aren't working because of the storm. We just have to wait until it's safe for help to come." "Are they okay?" Tommy whispered. Harold didn't know how to answer that question. Floods could be deadly, especially in the mountains. But looking at this frightened child, he couldn't bring himself to share those fears. "Your parents are probably looking for you right now," Harold said. "They're not going to stop until they find you." Tommy wiped his nose on his sleeve. "I was so scared. The water came so fast and everything was washing away. Dad yelled for me to run to higher ground, but I got confused. I didn't know which way to go." "You did the right thing," Harold told him. "You kept walking and stayed alive until I found you. That was very brave." Harold made Tommy some hot chocolate and scrambled eggs for breakfast. The boy ate slowly, like he was still figuring out if he could trust this strange man who had rescued him. Harold understood. If he were 8 years old and lost, he would be scared too. "What do you do?" Tommy asked between bites of eggs. "I clean a school," Harold said. "I mop the floors and empty the trash cans. Make sure everything is neat and tidy, for the kids." "Do you like kids?" Harold paused. That was a harder question than it seemed. I think kids are pretty Ishal, he said finally. They see the world differently than grown-ups do. As the day went on, Harold found himself talking more than he had in years. Tommy was curious about everything. He wanted to know how Harold had built the cabin, why he lived alone in the mountains, and whether he had ever seen any bears. There was a big black bear here last month, Harold told him. He came right up to my porch looking for food. I watched him from the window for about an hour. Were you scared? Tommy asked. A little, Harold admitted, but mostly I felt sorry for him. He was just hungry and looking for something to eat before winter comes. Harold showed Tommy around the small cabin. There wasn't much to see. A tiny kitchen, one bedroom, and the main room with the fireplace. But Tommy seemed fascinated by everything, especially Harold's collection of wood carvings on the mantel. Did you make these? Tommy asked, picking up a small wooden owl. Yeah, it's just something I do to keep my hands busy in the evenings. Could you teach me? Harold looked at the boy's eager face. He had never taught anyone to carve before. It was something he had learned from his own father many years ago. I suppose I could show you how to make something simple. They spent the afternoon working with a small piece of pine wood and Harold's carving knife. Harold did most of the actual cutting while Tommy watched and helped sand the rough edges smooth. Slowly, a little wooden dog began to take shape. It looks like Buddy, Tommy said excitedly. That's my dog at home. He's brown and white just like this. Tell me about Buddy, Harold said as he carefully shaped the dog's ears. Tommy's whole face lit up. He's the best dog ever. He sleeps in my bed every night, and he follows me everywhere. When I get home from school, he gets so excited that he runs in circles and barks. Mom says he loves me more than anyone in the whole world. Harold smiled as he listened to Tommy talk about his dog, his friends at school, and his favorite video games. The boys' chatter filled the quiet cabin with a kind of life Harold had forgotten existed. For years, the only sounds in his home had been the crackling fire and his own footsteps on the wooden floors. As evening approached, Tommy started to get quiet again. Harold could see the worry creeping back into his young face. They're going to find you, Harold said quietly. Sometimes rescue takes a while, especially in weather like this, but they will find you. What if they don't? Tommy asked in a small voice. Harold set down his carving knife and looked at the boy seriously. Tommy, I'm going to tell you something important. Sometimes bad things happen that we can't control, but good people don't give up. Your parents won't give up looking for you, and I won't give up taking care of you until they do. That night, Harold made up a bed for Tommy on the couch, near the fireplace. He gave the boy his warmest blankets and an extra pillow. As Tommy settled in for sleep, he looked up at Harold with trust in his eyes that made the old man's throat tight. Harold, Tommy said softly. Yeah, buddy? Thank you for saving me. Harold turned away quickly so Tommy wouldn't see the tears in his eyes. Get some sleep, son. As Harold lay in his own bed that night, listening to the storm still raging outside, he realized something had changed inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't going to sleep thinking about all the things he had lost. Instead, he was thinking about this brave little boy sleeping by his fireplace and how much he wanted to keep him safe. The wooden dog sat on the table beside Tommy's makeshift bed, a small reminder that even in the darkest storms, people could still create something beautiful together. Harold fell asleep to the sound of Tommy's steady breathing, feeling less alone than he had in longer than he could remember. 50 miles away in the valley, Dr. David Chen paced back and forth in the emergency command center that had been set up at the local fire station. He hadn't slept in 2 days. His clothes were still damp from searching the flooded campground himself, even though the rescue teams had told him to let them handle it. His wife Lisa sat at a folding table, staring at a map covered in red circles and X marks. Each mark represented an area that had already been searched. Each empty circle meant another place where their son wasn't found. She had been making phone calls all morning, talking to anyone who might have seen a lost 8-year-old boy. We need more helicopters, David said to Captain Rodriguez, the head of the search and rescue team. The ones we have can't cover enough ground fast enough. Sir, I understand your frustration, Captain Rodriguez replied patiently. But we're dealing with the worst storm this area has seen in 20 years. Half our aircraft are grounded because of the wind. The teams that are out there are doing everything they can. Lisa looked up from her map. It's been 3 days, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. How can a little boy survive 3 days in this weather? David sat down beside his wife and took her hand. Both of them were doctors. They had spent years saving other people's children, but all their medical training couldn't help them now. They felt completely helpless. Tommy is smart, David said, trying to convince himself as much as Lisa. Remember when he got lost at the mall last year?
He found a security guard and told them exactly what to do. He knows how to think when he's scared. The storm had turned their family camping trip into a nightmare in just minutes. One moment they were roasting marshmallows around the campfire.
And the next moment a wall of water was rushing through their campsite. David had grabbed their camping gear while Lisa secured their tent. But when they turned around, Tommy was gone. They had searched for hours in the rain and darkness, calling his name until their voices were hoarse. When morning came, they realized the flood had washed away all the trails they knew. Their son could be anywhere in hundreds of square miles of wilderness. Sheriff Williams walked into the command center with his radio crackling. We've got some good news and some bad news, he announced. The good news is the Weather Service says the storm should start clearing up tomorrow. The bad news is we found more damage than we expected. 3 more bridges are out, and Highway 9 is completely washed away. What does that mean for the search? Lisa asked. It means there are areas we still can't get to with our ground teams, Sheriff Williams said. But once the weather clears, we can get more aircraft up and start checking those remote areas. David felt his frustration building again. Remote areas? You mean there are places you haven't even looked yet? Mr. Chen, I know this is hard to hear, but yes. The mountains up there are full of old logging roads and hunting cabins. Some of those places don't even show up on our regular maps. But that could actually be good news. If your son found shelter somewhere, that's where it would be. At that moment, a young volunteer named Jake burst through the door. You need to see this, he said, holding up his phone. Tommy's story is everywhere, online. People are sharing it on every social media platform. Lisa took the phone and saw a video of herself from yesterday's news conference, pleading for help finding Tommy. The video had been shared thousands of times. The comment section was full of people offering prayers and promising to join the search. There's more, Jake said excitedly. 3 news stations from the city are sending crews up here. And there's a group of volunteer searchers driving up from the state capitol. They should be here by tonight. David felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. How many volunteers? About 50 so far, but more are coming. Someone set up a Facebook group and it already has over 10,000 members. People are organizing search parties, bringing supplies, even donating money for helicopter fuel. Sheriff Williams looked impressed. I've never seen anything like this for a missing person case. Usually we're lucky to get a dozen volunteers. Lisa wiped tears from her eyes, but for the first time in days, they weren't tears of despair. All these people want to help find our little boy. People love stories about missing kids, Jake explained. But there's something special about Tommy's case. Maybe it's because you two are doctors who help other people, or maybe it's just because he's such a cute kid. But everyone wants to help bring him home. That evening, the fire station parking lot filled with cars and trucks as volunteers arrived from all over the state. Some brought their own search equipment. Others brought food and coffee for the rescue teams. A few even brought trained search dogs. Captain Rodriguez called an emergency meeting to organize all the new help. We've divided the search area into grids, he explained to the crowd of volunteers. Each team will take one grid and search it thoroughly. Remember, we're looking for a small boy, but also any signs that someone has been in the area. Footprints, broken branches, anything that looks disturbed. An older man named Frank raised his hand. What about those old cabins up in the high country? My grandfather used to hunt up there. There are places that haven't been on any official map for 50 years. That's exactly what we need, Captain Rodriguez said. Local knowledge. If you know about places that aren't on our maps, please mark them for us. David and Lisa watched as dozens of strangers bent over maps, marking locations and sharing stories about remote areas they knew. Each mark represented new hope that Tommy might have found shelter somewhere. A reporter from Channel 7 News approached David and Lisa. "Dr. Chen, how does it feel to see so many people come together to help find your son?" David struggled to find words. "It's overwhelming," he said finally. "We've spent our whole careers trying to help other people's families. Now we're the ones who need help, and all these strangers are treating Tommy like he's their own child." Lisa nodded. "When something like this happens, you realize that most people are good. They see a family in trouble, and they want to do something about it." As night fell, search teams with flashlights and headlamps headed out into the darkness. Others prepared to start again at first light. The command center stayed busy all night with people coordinating searches, updating maps, and tracking leads. David and Lisa tried to get some rest on cots that had been set up for them, but sleep was impossible. Every time a radio crackled with an update, they held their breath hoping for good news. Every time a search team returned empty-handed, their hearts sank a little more. But something had changed. They were no longer alone in their desperate search for Tommy. Hundreds of people now shared their hope and determination. Somewhere out there in the mountains, their little boy was waiting to be found. And tomorrow, when the storm finally broke, an army of searchers would be ready to bring him. Harold woke up on the fourth morning to a sound he hadn't heard in days. Silence. The constant roar of wind and rain had finally stopped. Sunlight was streaming through his cabin windows for the first time since he had found Tommy on that dark mountain road. He looked over at the couch where Tommy was still sleeping, clutching the wooden dog they had carved together. The boy looked peaceful and healthy. Nothing like the scared, half-frozen child Harold had rescued from the storm. Over the past few days, Tommy had become more than just someone Harold was helping. He felt like family. Harold quietly made coffee and stepped out onto his porch. The storm had left its mark everywhere. Trees were down across his driveway, and debris was scattered all around the cabin. But the air was clear and crisp, and he could hear birds singing in the distance. It was the kind of morning that made you grateful to be alive. Behind him, he heard Tommy stirring inside the cabin. The boy appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes and holding his wooden dog. "The storm stopped," Tommy said, his voice still. "Sleepy?" "Sure did," Harold replied. "Looks like today might be the day we get you back to your family." Tommy walked over and stood beside Harold on the porch. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Harold realized that part of him didn't want this day to come. These few days with Tommy had been the happiest he'd felt in years. "Are you sad that I have to go?" Tommy asked quietly. Harold looked down at the boy, surprised by how well Tommy could read his feelings. "I'm happy that you'll be with your mom and dad again, but I'll miss having you here." "I'll miss you too," Tommy said. "Could I come visit you sometime?" Before Harold could answer, they both heard it, the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoing through the valley. The sound got louder and louder until Harold could see a military helicopter rising above the tree line, scanning the mountainside below. "That's for me, isn't it?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide with excitement and nervousness. "I think so," Harold said. He felt his heart racing as he watched the helicopter circle closer to his cabin. After 4 days of isolation, the outside world was about to crash back into their quiet little sanctuary. Harold ran inside and grabbed an old sheet from his closet. He spread it out on the small clearing in front of his cabin and weighed down the corners with rocks. The white fabric would be easy for the helicopter crew to spot from above. Within minutes, the helicopter was directly overhead. Harold could see faces in the windows, and someone was pointing down at his cabin. The aircraft circled twice, probably, looking for a safe place to land, then settled down in the clearing about 50 yards away. As the rotors slowed down, Harold took Tommy's hand. "You ready for this, buddy?" Tommy squeezed Harold's hand tight and nodded. Together, they walked toward the helicopter as the crew jumped out. Harold could see that these weren't just regular rescue workers. Some of them were wearing military uniforms, and there were people with cameras and recording equipment. A woman in a rescue uniform ran toward them. "Are you Tommy Chen?" she called out. "Yes, ma'am," Tommy replied politely, just like Harold had taught him over the past few days. Woman knelt down in front of Tommy and smiled. "Hi, Tommy. My name is Captain Martinez. Your mom and dad have been looking everywhere for you. They're going to be so happy to see you." More people were getting out of the helicopter now. Harold could see a man and woman running toward them, and even from a distance he could tell these were Tommy's parents. The woman was crying and calling Tommy's name. Tommy let go of Harold's hand and ran toward them. "Mom! Dad!" The reunion was everything Harold had imagined it would be. Tommy's mother dropped to her knees and wrapped her son in her arms, tears streaming down her face. His father joined them, and for a moment all three of them just held each other tight. Harold stood back and watched, feeling both happy and heartbroken at the same time. This was what he had been hoping for since the moment he found Tommy on that dark road. But seeing it actually happen felt like losing something precious. After a few minutes, Tommy's parents looked up and noticed Harold standing there. They walked over with Tommy between them, their faces full of gratitude and curiosity. "You must be Harold," Tommy's father said, extending his hand. "I'm David, and this is my wife Lisa. We can never thank you enough for what you've done." Harold shook their hands, feeling awkward with all the attention. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Lisa said firmly. "Not everyone would have stopped in that storm. Not everyone would have opened their home to a stranger's child. You saved our son's life." Tommy tugged on his mother's hand. "Mom, Harold taught me how to carve animals out of wood. Look." He held up the wooden dog proudly. Lisa examined the carving with amazement. "Tommy, this is beautiful. You made this?" "Harold helped me," Tommy said. "He said I could keep it to remember our time together." David looked around at Harold's simple cabin and the mountain wilderness surrounding it. "You live here alone?" "For about 15 years now," Harold replied. "It's quiet, but I like it that way." "What kind of work do you do?" Lisa asked. Harold felt a little embarrassed. These people were clearly educated and successful, while he was just a janitor. "I clean the elementary school down in town. Not much, but it pays the bills." Tommy spoke up excitedly. "Harold knows everything about the mountains. He showed me how to tell which way is north by looking at the moss on trees, and he makes the best hot chocolate in the world." The rescue team was getting impatient to leave. Captain Martinez approached the group. "Folks, we need to get Tommy to the hospital for a checkup, and the weather could turn bad again. We should head out soon." David and Lisa looked at Harold with expressions that seemed to say this conversation wasn't over. "Harold, we'd like to talk more when things calm down," David said. "Would that be okay?" "Sure," Harold said, though he couldn't imagine what else there was to say. As they walked back toward the helicopter, Tommy suddenly broke away from his parents and ran back to Harold. He threw his small arms around Harold's waist and hugged him tight. "Thank you for taking care of me," Tommy said, his voice muffled against Harold's shirt. "You're the best friend I ever had." Harold knelt down and hugged Tommy back, fighting to keep his emotions under control. "You take care of yourself, son. And don't forget what I taught you about being brave." "I won't forget anything," Tommy promised. As the helicopter lifted off with Tommy and his family inside, Harold stood in his clearing and watched it disappear over the mountains. The silence that followed felt different than the peaceful quiet he was used to. For the first time in 15 years, his cabin felt truly empty. But as Harold looked down at the clearing where the helicopter had landed, he noticed something Tommy had dropped. It was a small piece of paper with a drawing on it. A picture of a man and a boy standing together in front of a cabin, with Harold and Tommy written at the bottom in careful second-grade handwriting. Harold smiled as he picked up the drawing. Maybe this wasn't really an ending after all. 3 weeks later, Harold was back to his normal routine at the school. He mopped the same floors, emptied the same trash cans, and ate his lunch alone in the maintenance room just like he had for 15 years. But everything felt different now. The hallways seemed quieter, and his cabin in the mountains felt too big for just one person. He had tried to go back to his old life, but memories of Tommy kept creeping in. When he carved wood in the evenings, he found himself making small animals that a little boy might like. When he made dinner, he automatically made enough for 2 people before catching himself. Harold was cleaning the main hallway after school when he heard familiar voices echoing from the front entrance. He looked up from his mop bucket and saw Tommy walking through the doors with his parents, looking around the school with wide, curious eyes. "Harold!" Tommy shouted when he spotted him, breaking away from his parents and running down the hallway. Harold dropped his mop and caught Tommy in a big hug. "Hey there, buddy. What are you doing here?" "We came to see you," Tommy said, grinning up at him. "Mom and Dad wanted to talk to you about something important." David and Lisa walked over, both of them smiling warmly. Harold felt a little nervous. In his work clothes with a mop in his hand, he felt out of place talking to these successful doctors. "Harold, thank you for agreeing to meet with us," Lisa said. "We've been thinking about you every day since the rescue." "How are you doing, son?" David asked. "We wanted to make sure you were okay after everything that happened." Harold wasn't sure how to answer. Nobody had asked him how he was doing in a very long time. "I'm fine," he said automatically. "Just back to work, you know." Tommy tugged on Harold's sleeve. "Show them the school. Show them where you work every day." For the next hour, Tommy dragged his parents around the school while Harold showed them the classrooms, the cafeteria, and the gymnasium. Tommy was fascinated by everything, asking questions about how Harold cleaned each room and whether he knew all the kids who went to school there. "Do the kids know how lucky they are to have you taking care of their school?" Lisa asked as they walked through the library. Harold shrugged. "They probably don't think about it much. Kids have more important things on their minds, but you make their school a clean, safe place to learn," David said. "That's important work." When they finished the tour, David and Lisa asked if they could talk privately. They found an empty classroom and sat down in the tiny plastic chairs. That made the adults look like giants. "Harold, we've learned some things about you over the past few weeks," Lisa began gently. "We hope you don't mind, but we wanted to understand more about the man who saved our son." Harold felt uncomfortable. "What kind of things?" "We know you're a veteran," David said, "and we know you lost your son while he was serving overseas." Harold's chest tightened. He didn't like talking about Michael. "That was a long time ago." "We also know that you've been living alone ever since," Lisa continued. "Harold, we can't imagine how hard that must have been." "I get by," Harold said, quietly. Tommy, who had been looking at books on a nearby shelf, came over and climbed into the chair next to Harold. "Are you sad about your son?" he asked, with the directness that only children possess. Harold looked at Tommy's innocent face and felt something break open inside his chest. "Yeah, buddy, I miss him a lot." "I bet he was brave like you," Tommy said, leaning against Harold's arm. David and Lisa exchanged a look before David spoke again. "Harold, watching Tommy with you at the cabin and seeing how much he cares about you, we realized something. You didn't just save our son's life. You gave him love and security when he was terrified and alone. You became family to him. And he became family to you too, didn't he?" Lisa added softly. Harold nodded, not trusting his voice to work properly. "We have a proposition for you," David said. "The elementary school where Tommy goes to school is looking for a new head custodian. It's a better position than what you have here, with better pay and benefits. But more importantly, it would mean being part of Tommy's daily life." Harold stared at them in disbelief. "You want me to work at Tommy's school?" "We want you to be part of our family," Lisa said. "Tommy talks about you every day. He asks when he can see Uncle Harold again, when you're coming to visit. Whether you're lonely in your cabin." "You called me Uncle Harold?" Harold asked Tommy. "That's what you are," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "You took care of me when I was scared. That makes you family." David leaned forward in his tiny chair. "Harold, We've also been thinking about your living situation. We know you love your cabin, but being so isolated, it can't be easy. We found a small house for rent just a few blocks from the school," Lisa said. "It has a workshop in the garage where you could do your wood carving, and it's only 20 minutes from our house." Harold felt overwhelmed. These people were offering to completely change his life. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Tommy said, bouncing in his chair. "Then we can see each other all the time, and you can teach me more carving, and I can show you my room, and we can have dinner together on Sundays." "You've already planned Sunday dinners?" Harold asked, smiling despite his confusion. "Mom said we could if you wanted to," Tommy said. "She makes really good spaghetti." Harold looked at David and Lisa, searching their faces for any sign that this was just politeness or guilt. But all he saw was genuine warmth and affection. "Why?" Harold asked quietly. "Why would you do all this for someone like me?" "Because," Lisa said, tears in her eyes. "In 4 days you loved our son like he was your own. You brought out his curiosity and his bravery. You made him feel safe when his whole world had turned upside down." "And because," David added, "we think you need a family as much as Tommy needs his Uncle Harold." Harold felt tears running down his cheeks. For 15 years, he had convinced himself that he was better off alone, that needing people would only lead to more loss and pain. But sitting in this classroom with Tommy leaning against his arm and these two kind people offering him a place in their lives, he realized how wrong he had been. "Okay," Harold said softly. "Okay?" Tommy asked excitedly. "Okay," Harold repeated louder this time. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Tommy jumped up and hugged Harold tight. "This is the best day ever." 6 months later, Harold stood in the hallway of Riverside Elementary School, watching the kids run to their classrooms. But he wasn't invisible anymore. Students waved and called out, "Good morning, Mr. Harold," as they passed by. Teachers stopped to chat with him about their weekends. Every afternoon, Tommy would find him before going home and tell him about his day. Every Sunday, Harold joined the Chen family for dinner, bringing wooden animals he had carved for Tommy during the week. The scared, lonely man who had found a lost boy in a storm was gone. In his place was someone who had remembered what it felt like to be part of a family, to be needed and loved. Harold had saved Tommy from the storm, but in the end, Tommy and his family had saved Harold from something much worse: a life without love. Sometimes the best rescues happen long after the emergency is over.